Hi, Jim of Shiloh Kahal again. And in this section, uh, I want to continue to break down the identity of the community itself. I think in order to know whether and how to take this community seriously in terms of what they're offering us, which is their library of scripture from which we're gathering important data. How do we respond to the War Scroll, the Damascus document, the community rule that is chock full of what appears to be prophetic information, and not just prophetic information, but just um, good doctrinal stuff related to the old writings. So we need to understand who these folks are. So I want to, well, I said in the previous section who I believe these, and I make who these folks are. Now I want to give you details, and this one will be maybe a little more slodging because there's just stuff to get through. But let me start. I'm going to be utilizing the same three books that I've compared for you. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation, Giza Vermes, the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English, and Florentino Garcia Martinez's The Dead Sea Scrolls Translated. They all have forewords trying to tell us who these folks are. And if you're going to, I will say that it's good to have all three because they all approach it differently and have different they provide different types of information and maybe even some different conclusions. I found that Giza Vermes and the complete Dead Sea Scrolls does a great job with history. In this one, we'll get the history of the intertestament period, um, just history that we don't get in the other two forwards and introductions. Some of it he doubles up on, he'll repeat it and different things. But so I'm going to utilize his book first before I go off to the others. And let me start with this chronology that he put out for us. Let me see if I can make it even larger here. Hopefully you can see it. And if I go that large, it gets it's a PDF document that, from an older edition. So if I make it too large, I lose some of its readability. It starts getting a little faded. So I'll just leave it at this size. And let me take you through this timeline. Let me start with this timeline because this is what we would call the intertestament period. This is post the times we get in Scripture. It's post Micah. Post Micah, we get Greece coming. We get the time of Daniel, right? When Greece come in and conquer Persia, who was the rulers of the land during all of our other writings, Ezra, Daniel, things of that nature. Well, then we have Greece come in. And we lose track with the coming of Greece. According to what we get out of scriptures, it's a blank, except for what we would take in Maccabees and some of our. So there are some scripture translations that offer the Maccabees and Tobit and a few things out there. So we've been a little privy to it, but mostly through the writings of the books of the Maccabees, primarily Maccabees 1 and 2. But this is the time frame that we're talking about, and it's been lost. It's been lost on the church. It's been lost on us. And I can speculate why, and it's because I think the devil, goes about roars about like a lion, seeking whom he may devour and what he can destroy. I mean, he's our enemy. He's our adversary. He's the Satan. He's our adversary. Okay, so let's start with this chronology and let's walk it down. But let me say, I think it was 322 that Greece conquered Persia. I don't know if it's, I'd have to go look. Somewhere I saw it. It's around that time. So don't get caught up on that. Somewhere in the 322 realm, Alexander conquers Persia. Alexander dies right away, and his kingdom is split into four, which we can read about in Daniel. The two primary kingdoms that form out of that would be the Ptolemies to the south, and that's Ptolemies, Ptolemies to the south, and then the Seleucids, that's Seleucids, to the north of us. And then we have over in the area of Greece, we had the other two splits, and don't quote me on them because they mostly get lost in antiquity. We don't really think about them too much. They were over in the area of Greece and Macedonia and things of that nature. But the two ruling where the split took place, and then we had the two ruling kingdoms or empires, that were contesting each other, were the Ptolemies to the south and the Seleucids to the north. And when we read Daniel, we have the king of the north and the king of the south, and we have the things that are happening. And then we got Rome over to the west, which would include the ships of the Kittim that come over and give the king of the north bad news, etc., which we're going to read about here. So that all takes place. Now, we open this chronology with BCE 197. So we have just entered the second century BC. And in 197, Judea becomes a province of the Seleucid Empire ruled by the Syrian successors of Alexander the Great. Prior to this, they were being ruled by the Ptolemies. And in the 3rd century, which would be, pre-197 BC, in the 200s, the Ptolemies are the ones that ordered the Greek translation from the Hebrew scriptures that gave us the Septuagint. That was the Ptolemies. But in BCE 197, the Seleucids take over. In 187, Seleucus IV starts doing, under the rule of the Seleucids, they begin a Hellenistic infiltration, which was resisted by the Zadokite high priest Onias III. So in 187, we still have a Zadokite high priest sitting in the priesthood, a Zadokite sitting in the high priesthood, and that's Onias III. And he was resisting Hellenism, resisting Greece trying to overwhelm the ways of Israel, the Torah and their ways, their priesthood. They're trying to turn them into a Greek province. And Onias is resisting that. But in 175 BC, Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, comes to power. And rather than continue to abut Onias, he just simply deposes Onias and replaces Onias with his Hellenophile brother Jason. So Jason, who is a Zadokite, but he's a Hellenist. He's just all in favor. He doesn't care about the ways of Torah. He doesn't care about Yahuwah and his ways. He only cares about, just the things of the world that we see so much today. And he ended up bribing Antiochus and gave Antiochus some money so that Antiochus would depose Onias and install Jason into that role. So in 175, we have the deposing of the legitimate priesthood by Greece, Antiochus IV of Greece, and in the place of the Zadokites, he installs Jason, the first of what we would call the Hellenistic priests. Now, Jason might have been a Zadokite, but he was not. I suppose you could say that he could have been a legitimate priest, but he wouldn't have been appointed appropriately, and he certainly didn't deserve the role of high priest. But even so, Jason only served for 3 years before he was expelled in favor of Menelaus, who was also a Hellenizing priest and who was in position from 172 to 162 BC, so for 10 years. And Menelaus, I don't know where he comes from, but I don't think he's a Levite, and he's certainly not a Zadokite. He was a Hellenistic priest installed by Greece who has nothing to do with the Zadokites. And he served for 10 years as high priest in the temple. We'll just keep going, because in 171, a year after Menelaus takes office, Onias gets murdered. Onias III gets murdered at the instigation of Menelaus. And that's when we get into forced Hellenization. So this is when, Greece quit playing around through Antiochus. They quit playing around. They started, they started, let me see. Yeah. They started forcing Hellenization and started pushing away from, what would have been the ways of Torah. In 169, Antiochus, led by this Hellenistic priest Menelaus, profaned and plundered the temple of Jerusalem. If you go into some of the history in the Maccabees, but then just go to Wikipedia and look up some of the history of Antiochus the fourth. You can read about all of this. He did. He goes in and he ransacks the temple. He steals the treasures of the temple. He does this. And then in 168, a year later, uh, first of all, in Daniel, you know that the king of the north, which would be Antiochus, is doing war against the king of the south, which would be the king of the Ptolemies, and has success. But then he comes back for some reason, and then he turns his attention, after he comes back, he turns his attention to head back again to the south and the king of the south. But it's in that second time that he heads down to the king of Egypt where the Ptolemies solicited and obtained the assistance of Rome, which was the growing real power, the Kittim, to the west. So as Antiochus comes down to do battle against the Ptolemies in the south, he's approached by and uh, thwarted by the Romans, who, through a commander, approach him and say, "No, you come down there. You're doing war with us. If you come, you'll be doing war with Rome." And Antiochus does not want, basically, I don't know what you want to call it. He backs off, but he's angry. And here you can follow this. In 169, Antiochus, led by Menelaus, profaned and plundered the temple of Jerusalem. And then a year later, Antiochus was thwarted by the Romans in his second campaign against Egypt. This is in Daniel, the ships of Kittim that came and thwarted his efforts. So then the king of the north returns to his land in wrath, and he's angry. He's angry because he's thwarted in that, and probably humiliated because he had to back down to the Romans. So in 167, as he comes back into the land, this is when he begins the persecution in earnest of those Jews or Yehudim who opposed the unification of the Seleucid Empire on the basis of Greek culture and religion. So everybody who was resisting this forced Hellenization, he came back and declared war on. There was an official abolition of Jewish religion and practice under threat of death. The temple was transformed into a sanctuary of Olympian Zeus. So here in 167 is where we're getting what we see written about in the Maccabees, where anybody who was uh, trying to practice Torah, horrible death, horrible things happening, uh, under the leadership of Antiochus. And under the leadership of Antiochus, everybody kind of knows that Antiochus IV came in and profaned the temple, sacrificed a pig, is what we all understood, but basically he turned it into the sanctuary of the Olympian Zeus. He wrested it away from the temple of Yahweh and gave it over to his god, the Olympian Zeus. Well, this persecution and all these things that were happening here was acceptable to many of the Yehudim, many of the people who don't care, just like we would see today. I mean, throughout their history, a whole bunch of the majority of society really just didn't care one way or the other. They just wanted to go do their own thing and just enjoy life and eat, drink, be merry, that kind of stuff. But but out in the countryside, those trying to practice Torah began to coalesce. And the father, Judas Maccabee, well, here I'll just read. In 166, we had the rising of the Maccabees, supported by the traditional parties under the leadership of Judas Maccabee. So one of the traditional parties was considered the Hasidim. Now, I haven't studied out the Hasidim too much, but in his book, Vermes does talk about the Hasidim and their role in all of this. And it was actually Judas Maccabee's father who actually really started pushing back. But Judas is the one that led the actual physical, um, demonstrable revolt against Greece. So in 166, the Maccabees out in the countryside began to form and do battle against the um, against the Greeks, and they had decent success. They won an awful lot of the battles and really took back an awful lot of certain things within the land. And in 165, they're talking about there being a truce, a cleansing of the temple, which was still held by Menelaus. So Menelaus was still the high priest, but the Maccabees came in and cleansed the temple. In 162, Demetrius Menelaus was executed by the Syrians, and Alcimus was appointed high priest by the king. So, okay, so actually, let me rephrase this. So Demetrius was the Syrian king. Demetrius I had Menelaus executed, and Alcimus is who Demetrius, I believe, appointed as high priest of the king. So Alcimus was the third Hellenistic, and he also had nothing to do with the Zadoks and probably not even the Levites. Clearly, the third of the Hellenistic priests appointed by the king. And then Judas, who was leading the revolt up here, Judas Maccabee, was killed in battle in 161 while Menelaus was still serving, and Jonathan, his brother, rose up to take his place. Now, Jonathan and Simon were the brothers of Judas, and both were involved in the revolt all along. But Judas was the leader until he was killed, and then Jonathan stepped up and assumed the leadership of the rebels and led the leadership until 152 BCE. Now, I would say that the formation, before I go any further, the formation of, if we go back up here to 175, here we have the Zadokites being deposed and an illegitimate priesthood forming. I would say that the Zadokites have been deposed, they've been kicked out, and the faithful remnant are all at, this is very distressing time. So the faithful begin to discuss and talk. And they didn't immediately just go form a community. It probably took a little while for them to organize a little bit and come together and to realize what's going on with these Hellenizing high priests. And so it seems like it would make sense that beginning in 175, we have the split. Because we have 175 and the split of the Zadokite priests and the faithful remnant. They're split away by Greece and the new Hellenizing high priest sitting in the temple. So we have the split in Israel taking place. And then I would say that Onias was murdered in 171, and then you got Antiochus is profaning and plundering the temple of in Jerusalem in 169. Antiochus thwarted by the Romans in his second campaign. Then we have the persecution of the Jews. So what we see happening here is what we know of in the Maccabees, but what's happening in the background? What's happening as that minority, as one of the authors will describe them, what's happening as they go and probably begin to coalesce and pull together and maybe organize. Maybe they found the ruins, because I believe it was an old fortress that they took over in what was Bethabara and later became known as Qumran, and they took over this compound where they went and started having meetings and doing some different things in this compound. And this was probably happening, although we don't hear about it in mainstream Christianity or anything else. All we hear about is what was taking place, the Maccabees against Greece. What we're not seeing is that the actual faithful remnant probably went and was forming what would become known as the community later during these formative periods of 169, 168, 167, 166, 164. That'd be what I would say would be the realistic, which is mid-second century BCE, that the community was being formed by the faithful remnant, and the community was being led by sons of Zadok, the priesthood, and priests, the Levites, and the faithful remnant. And then throughout the land were faithful remnant. They didn't all go live there in the compound. The faithful were living out and about, etc. But this compound was the center, the focal point, the center of influence for what became known as the Way. It was the center. It was Damascus, referred to as Damascus in at least one document. And so this is the focal point, the center point. This community. This is where they were accumulating their library, and we had the community setting up and trying to operate by community rules, which would have been just simply, once you're removed from the temple and the way that it had been set up, now you're having to reorganize and set up community rule. How do you act? How do you behave? Who's in charge? How does it play out? Well, there you have the community rules being developed and written in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Damascus document, which seems to have been written during this period of time in the community, known as Damascus. So this is the formation of the community taking place in the background. And we have then the teacher of righteousness, in my opinion, who is leading this community and is the Messiah. And the community's focus is correct Torah, correct seeking the ways. Whereas in mainstream society that we see formulating up here, that we're reading about here, and that we've come to know as Judaism and Jewish history, this is the history we've been taught. We're missing the history of where the faithful remnant went to in our church history and in our church information. So let me keep going here a little bit. So we go to 161 BCE, and Judas is killed in battle. Jonathan assumes leadership. Alcimus dies in 160. Now here's a gap that I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I haven't really. I'd have to study this out some more. But there's a gap here. 160 where Alcimus dies, and it's not until 152 that Alexander Belus, who had usurped the Seleucid throne, appointed Jonathan as high priest here. So basically, it looks like, because they're saying he led the rebellion from 161 to 152, it appears that with his appointment in 152 to the high priesthood, that the rebellion ends. They quit fighting. The Greeks are still at this time the dominant empire in the land, in the Holy Lands, not as dominant as Rome is becoming in the West, but they're still the power base, and they could keep fighting the Israel, but with this appointment of Jonathan to the high priesthood, we basically have a truce, and we have some semi-autonomy for the land of Israel for the rest of this period of time that we're going to talk about. So with the appointment of Jonathan to the high priest, we have what appears to be a truce between Israel and Greece, and Jonathan now sitting as the high priest and really starting the Hasmonean dynasty, because he's the first of the Maccabees to sit in the high priest. Illegitimately, because he's not. While he's a Levite, the Maccabees are Levites and priests. They're not sons of Zadok, so they should not be sitting in the high priest role. To do so is wrong. And I will take this opportunity to say, when Giza Vermes refers to this, when we get to it, I'll show it to you. But he refers to this as they held like they had some sort of. Well, I'll just wait till we get there, because he doesn't really grasp the importance of the sons of Zadok sitting in the high priesthood. They just think it's like. Well, when we get there, I'll just go over that. Okay. So then in 145, after Jonathan is sitting on the throne, Antiochus VI, who is the son of this Alexander Belus up here, raised to the throne by Tryphon, who was a leader in Greek circles, was a general of Antiochus. He had Jonathan named, he raised to the throne by Tryphon. Okay, so I'm sorry. So Antiochus VI, the son of Alexander, was raised to the throne by Tryphon. So Tryphon is a powerhouse. He's a general. His father's general, and Alexander Belus is general. And then Jonathan was named governor of Syria. And Simon, his brother, was made a military governor of the Palestinian littoral. So Jonathan was, at this point, he's already serving as the high priest, but now he's made governor of Syria. So now he's in a leadership role, a political leadership role, which also is not, I'd have to go. I've only heard that that the priests are not supposed to be sitting in political positions like that. But if that's true, then we've now not only we got him sitting inappropriately as high priest, now he's entering as high priest also a political position of governor, which is also against Torah, I believe. And Simon, his brother, is made a military governor of the Palestinian littoral. But ultimately, Tryphon, the general of Alexander Belus, who appointed Antiochus VI, ends up arresting Jonathan and then executes him a year later. And he does this in 143. And then in 143, once Jonathan is arrested, Simon, his brother, is elected. He's not appointed like Jonathan was by Alexander Belus, a Seleucid or a Greek ruler, leader. Simon is the first of these Hasmonean or Maccabean priest, who is elected by a council of the Yehudim, the Jews. So the Jews themselves, in opposition to Torah, elect a non-Zadokite into the position of high priest. If we didn't have a split before, this would be a split, because really the faithful can't. And you'll see, if you follow, I'm not going to read all of the history there, but you'll see that the Hasidim and some of those were opposing some of these things that were taking place. But the larger society was not opposing. They didn't care who was sitting in the role of high priest, or that they were doing it illegitimately. Only the faithful remnant cared that the high priest was illegitimate and sitting in a place where it ought not to be. So then in 143, Simon was elected high priest and ethnarch. Ethnarch, that meant he was king and priest, which was, instead of just being governor like Jonathan was, now he becomes king and priest. In 142, Jonathan's executed. In 140, Simon's titles are confirmed as hereditary, which is actually, you know what? That's right, I read in there. This is the beginning of what they called the Hasmonean dynasty, because it was considered hereditary. Prior to this, the Maccabees were not claiming to be sitting there by family, by name. So Simon's titles are confirmed as hereditary in 140 BC, and the foundation of the Maccabean or Hasmonean dynasty arises here, with Simon's titles being confirmed as hereditary. So now everybody who sits in that role of high priest and king is placed there because they are the sons of Maccabee, not the sons of Zadok or the sons of Aaron. Okay, then Simon is murdered in 135 by his son-in-law. And then John Hyrcanus I becomes high priest and ethnarch. And he was the one opposed by the Pharisees. The Pharisees didn't want him sitting on the priest. Well, I guess I know that he had like 80 of the Pharisees killed at that point in time. So there were some things going on. But the Pharisees were coming to power during this period of time and gaining popularity during this time and adding to the Torah by oral traditions, etc. Now, I'm going to say that and I mentioned it in the other video, Jonathan, I think Judas would have been a friend to Israel. Jonathan, probably a friend to Israel, even if he's making these mistakes. Simon, probably a friend to Israel, even though he's making these mistakes and would have been illegitimate and should not have been doing those things. But it's pretty clear that with John Hyrcanus coming on the scene, he was a wicked high priest. He began persecutions and different things that Alexander Jannaeus, his successor, also did. He also was resisted by the Pharisees. I think it was Alexander that actually killed the 80 Pharisees. But starting with John Hyrcanus, we ended up with Hasmonean or Maccabean priests that were evil. They not only were they sitting evilly in the wrongly in the seat of high priest and in the seat of political power. Now with John Hyrcanus, there's no question they are operating evilly, doing evil things that by their actions themselves are evil. So certainly, even if Jonathan and Simon and Judas even were not to be considered the wicked priest, certainly you could classify John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Alexander Jannaeus, Alexandra, his wife, Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus II, and Hyrcanus II, and Antiochus and Antigonus, son of Aristobulus. All of them could easily be considered wicked priests. These were the Hasmonean priests in succession. Now, in 63 BC is when Rome invaded the land and took the land. Now, they didn't have to come in and fight. They just kind of, as they did fight, they had already more or less defeated Greece and pretty much walked into Palestine and took over. And it was just one of their provinces without much to do. And from 63 to 37, they allowed the Hasmonean priests to sit in the governorship, the rulership, the kingship. But in 37, after whatever number of years that is, for 23, about 26 years, they left the Hasmoneans in place in the high priesthood, but they removed them from the kingship. And actually, here's Hyrcanus being executed in 30 BCE. All right. So in 37 BC is when Herod the Great was appointed by Rome. And he was the king of the land appointed by Rome in the provinces, in this pseudo um, autonomy that Israel had during this time. Herod was appointed, and it was during Herod the Great that uh, Yahushua is born, our Messiah, Jesus, the Messiah, is born. Augustus was the emperor from 27 to 14 BCE. 6 BCE is roughly when Yahushua was born. And then we had this period of time where you have from 4 BCE to 6 BC where Archelaus was ethnarch of Judea and Samaria instead of Herod the Great. And the next emperor after Augustus was Tiberius. And then in 26 AD, Pontius Pilate was appointed the prefect of Judea, which really would have, I believe, um, this would be this similar to the kings like Herod and Archelaus in the various provinces. Pontius Pilate was not a king per se, but a governor appointed to the prefect of Judea um, by Rome. And then we had the crucifixion of Yahushua. And then we had in 66 to 70 the first Jewish war ending in the capture of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by Titus. And then we had the fall of Masada and then a second unsuccessful Jewish war against Rome led by Simeon Bar Sheba. Okay, so that is the timeline and the backdrop of the community and the teacher and the things that were happening and the prophecies. Now I'm going to turn to some of the writings of these authors in their forewords and introduction.